The Second World War saw the German war machine sweep across Europe, a seemingly unstoppable force under the iron will of Adolf Hitler. The Wehrmacht, bound by a personal oath of unconditional loyalty to the Führer, seemed a monolithic instrument of his will. Yet, beneath the surface of total obedience, a quiet and dangerous undercurrent of dissent was forming. Within the ranks of this very organization, from the battlefields of the Eastern Front to the High Command in Berlin, a minority of soldiers, officers, and intellectuals began to recognize the catastrophic and criminal nature of the regime they served. They were trapped in a profound moral paradox. To remain loyal to their oath meant being complicit in mass murder and national suicide, while to act against it constituted high treason in a state that punished dissent with death. These were men who, in the face of absolute power, found their conscience to be a more compelling authority than the dictator they had sworn to obey. Early acts of resistance were often subtle, localized, and profoundly personal, born from the direct shock of witnessing state-sanctioned barbarity. On the Eastern Front, many Wehrmacht officers were horrified by the Einsatzgruppen, the SS death squads operating behind the lines, and the systematic massacres of Jewish men, women, and children. Some commanders, at great personal risk, deliberately misinterpreted or lost orders for brutal reprisals against civilians, or the execution of captured Soviet commissars. Others used their authority to provide false papers, turn a blind eye to escapes, or secretly divert food to starving prisoners of war. These were not grand plots, but isolated sparks of humanity. For many, the cognitive dissonance between the clean war they believed they were fighting and the genocidal reality they witnessed became unbearable, transforming quiet disillusionment into a firm, albeit secret, resolve to act. One of the earliest and most resolute souls of the military resistance was General Henning von Tresckow, a staff officer for Army Group Center on the Eastern Front. A devout Christian and a Prussian patriot, Tresckow was radicalized by the atrocities he witnessed, particularly the Babi Yar massacre. He came to believe that Hitler was not just Germany's political enemy, but a moral plague that had to be eradicated for the nation's soul to survive. He famously remarked, "The assassination must be attempted, whatever the cost, even if it fails. We must show the world that not all of us were like him." Tresckow became the operational and moral center of a growing conspiracy, using his position to identify and recruit like-minded officers who were willing to commit the ultimate act of treason to save their country. Tresckow and his aide, Fabian von Schlabrendorf, began to meticulously weave a web of conspiracy that extended into the very heart of the German military. They found crucial allies in the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, which was led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris and his deputy, General Hans Oster. Canaris and Oster, deeply disillusioned with the regime, turned their organization into a clandestine hub of resistance, providing false documents, warning allies of German intentions, and shielding conspirators from the Gestapo. This secret network operated under unimaginable stress. Every meeting was a risk, every phone call potentially monitored. The air was thick with the threat of betrayal, and all involved knew that discovery would not just mean their own agonizing death by torture, but also the brutal reprisal against their families under the Sippenhaft-Kin liability laws. The conspirators' first major attempt came on March 13, 1943. After Hitler visited Tresckow's headquarters on the Eastern Front, Tresckow asked a colonel in Hitler's entourage, Heinz Brandt, to carry a package onto Hitler's FW-100 Condor plane, claiming it was a box of brandy as a lost bet. Inside, however, were two British-made clamshell time bombs. The fuse was a chemical acid designed to eat through a wire, giving them just enough time. Tresckow and Schlabrendorf waited in agonizing suspense for the news of the crash. It never came. The plane landed safely in Rastenburg. The bomb had failed. The extreme cold in the unheated cargo hold had frozen the chemical detonator. In a move of incredible daring, Schlabrendorf had to fly to Hitler's headquarters the very next day, retrieve the package, and replace the bombs with actual bottles of brandy before the plot was discovered. Just 1 week later, the resistance circle tried again. This time, the plan involved a suicide bombing. Hitler was scheduled to visit the Zughaus, a military museum in Berlin, to view captured Soviet weapons. Colonel Rudolf Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorf, an associate of Treschow, volunteered for the mission as the expert guiding the tour. Gersdorf concealed the bombs in his greatcoat pockets. He activated the 10-minute chemical fuses, intending to grab Hitler in a death embrace and blow them both up. But the plot was again thwarted by Hitler's notorious restlessness and paranoia. The Fuhrer rushed through the exhibit, viewing the weapons in less than 8 minutes. Gersdorf, in a desperate race against time, just barely managed to slip into a men's room and defuse the bombs before they detonated, washing the evidence of his own planned martyrdom down a drain. Image prompt: a lone German officer standing rigidly in a crowd, his hand near his chest. A look of grim determination in a grand hall filled with military displays, black and white, vintage wwII to documentary style. These near misses taught the conspirators a valuable lesson. Killing Hitler was only half the battle. The true challenge was seizing control of the state in the chaotic aftermath, before the SS and other loyal Nazi factions could consolidate power. To this end, General Friedrich Olbricht, a key plotter within the Reserve Army headquarters in Berlin, devised a brilliant and audacious plan. They would use an existing government contingency order, codenamed Operation Valkyrie. This plan was ironically designed to use the Reserve Army to crush an internal rebellion, such as an uprising by slave laborers. The conspirators secretly modified the orders. Upon Hitler's death, they would trigger Valkyrie, claiming that a rogue element of the SS had attempted a coup. The Reserve Army would then be legally mobilized to arrest key Nazi and SS officials, secure Berlin, and install a new government. It was a plan to use the system's own machinery to destroy it. The conspiracy desperately needed a new trigger man, someone with the fanaticism to see it through and, critically, regular access to Hitler. They found him in Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, a charismatic, aristocratic staff officer. Stauffenberg was no early opponent of the Nazis, but his experiences in the war, coupled with his devout Catholicism, turned him into a fervent enemy of the regime. Default text: after being severely wounded in Tunisia in 1943, losing his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left, he was reassigned to the Reserve Army headquarters at the Bendler Block in Berlin. This position brought him into direct contact with Olbricht and the other plotters, and as Chief of Staff to the Reserve Army's commander, he was one of the few officers who would be in the same room as Hitler during military briefings. Stauffenberg brought a new, driving urgency to the plot. He was appalled by the indecision and hesitation of some of the older officers, and believed time was running out. The Allied D-Day landings in June 1944 made it clear that the war was lost, and every day it continued meant the useless deaths of thousands and the complete destruction of Germany. Stauffenberg took control. He refined the Valkyrie orders, ensuring they were ready to be transmitted the instant confirmation of Hitler's death was received. He declared himself willing to be the assassin. Despite the immense difficulty of arming a bomb with only 3 fingers, his courage was absolute, driven by a cold fury and the belief that he was acting not as a traitor, but as the truest patriot, to end the senseless slaughter. The date was set, July 20th, 1944. Stauffenberg arrived at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's fortified headquarters in East Prussia, for a midday briefing. He carried a briefcase containing 2 blocks of British plastic explosive. The plan was nearly derailed immediately. The meeting, usually held in a thick-walled concrete bunker, was moved at the last minute to a flimsy wooden barracks, which would significantly lessen the bomb's concussive force. Then, as Stauffenberg and his adjutant, Werner von Heffen, tried to arm the bombs in an anteroom, they were interrupted by an orderly telling them to hurry. Flustered, and working with his 3 damaged fingers, Stauffenberg was only able to arm one of the 2 bombs before he was called into the conference. Stauffenberg entered the briefing room, where 24 men were gathered around a massive, heavy oak map table. He managed to place the armed briefcase on the floor, pushing it under the table only a few feet from where Hitler was leaning over. After a few minutes, He mumbled an excuse about needing to take an urgent phone call from Berlin and quietly left the room. At 12:40 p.m., a blinding flash and a deafening explosion ripped through the barracks. The building was devastated, debris and bodies hurled into the air. Stauffenberg, watching from a safe distance, saw the smoke and carnage and was utterly convinced that no one inside could have survived. He and Heffen bluffed their way past 3 SS checkpoints and raced to an airfield to fly back to Berlin, believing their mission was a success. When Stauffenberg landed at Rangsdorf Airfield near Berlin 3 hours later, he was stunned to find that nothing had happened. General Olbricht and the other conspirators at the Bendler block had hesitated, waiting for Stauffenberg's definitive confirmation. "He's dead. I saw it myself," Stauffenberg yelled, finally galvanizing them into action. The Valkyrie orders were frantically sent out via teleprinter to army units across Germany and occupied France. For a few brief hours, chaos reigned. In Berlin, the city's Guard battalion, unaware of the plot, began securing government buildings and even arrested propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. In Paris, the military governor, a co-conspirator, successfully rounded up the entire SS and Gestapo leadership. The coup was underway, but Hitler was not dead. The flimsy walls of the wooden hut had vented the blast's pressure, and the solid oak table leg, which Colonel Brandt had coincidentally moved the briefcase behind, had shielded Hitler from the worst of the explosion. He was injured, his eardrums burst, his arms singed but very much alive. His survival was the plot's undoing. News of it began to spread, conflicting with the Valkyrie orders. The decisive moment came when Major Otto Riemer, leading the troops in Berlin, was ordered by Goebbels to speak to Hitler directly, put on the phone with the Führer himself. Riemer's loyalty snapped back. Hitler ordered him to crush the coup with ruthless force. Loyal Wehrmacht and SS units quickly surrounded the Bendler block, and the putsch collapsed. General Fromm, the reserve army commander who had known of the plot and done nothing, sought to save himself by silencing the leaders. That very night, he convened a summary court-martial. Stauffenberg, Olbricht, Heffen, and another conspirator were dragged into the courtyard of the Bendler block and executed by a makeshift firing squad. Stauffenberg's last words were, "Long live our sacred Germany." This was only the beginning. Himmler's Gestapo unleashed a wave of terror, arresting over 7,000 people. Nearly 5,000 were executed, many after humiliating show trials before the fanatic judge Roland Freisler. Their deaths filmed for Hitler's viewing. The purge decimated the Prussian officer corps and extinguished the last organized resistance within Germany. Operation Valkyrie failed to kill Hitler and failed to end the war, which would drag on for another 10 agonizing months. In the immediate aftermath, the plotters were vilified as traitors who had stabbed the nation in the back. Yet their legacy is not one of failure, but of profound moral necessity. They were men who, trapped within a criminal regime, chose to break their oath to a tyrant in order to honor their true duty to their country and to humanity. As Henning von Treschow had said before his own suicide, their actions proved to the world and to future generations that not all Germans had followed Hitler blindly into the abyss. They acted, in their own words, to save the decency of their nation, ensuring that even in its darkest hour, the light of conscience was never fully extinguished.